Okay, well, Judith Godfrey, our very own Associate Secretary of the Tuesday Club, is proudly giving the presentation today about her father, Leonidas D. Marinelli, who is the founder of internal radiation dosimetry, developer of the crystal spectrometry for low-level gamma ray scanning, and developer of first cancer treatments at Memorial Sloan Kettering Institute in New York. During the Cold War, Leonidas D. Marinelli led the nationwide search to obtain knowledge about future effects of radium in humans, which the military, medicine, and industry so urgently needed. Judith has her MA degree from the University of Chicago in Humanities and her BA degree from Marquette University in English and French. She is mother of 3 children. Her daughter is here today and has been adjunct professor of English at Oakton Community College, supervisor of English teachers at Northeastern University, and a teacher in the Chicago Public Schools. In February this year, an article by Judith was published in Radiation Research Journal, telling the story of her father's 40-year contributions, describing them holistically and in layman's language. The Tuesday Club is pleased to have her speak at today's meeting. Please welcome Judith.
Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to see you here. Thank you for coming. And I look forward to telling you about the contributions to nuclear medicine made by my father from 1930 to 1972. First, I want to maybe start with a little story that maybe will give you an idea of where I started from. I was a high school freshman when my father's name was in the papers because he was leading the national search for information about future effects of radium in the human body. So my friends' parents must have been reading the newspapers. So my friend said to me, well, what is your father doing at Argonne Laboratory, which was the first national scientific laboratory established by the United States government. So I asked my father, what shall I say? So he said, well, tell them I'm trying to determine the maximum permissible burden of radioactivity in the human body. Well, I ran upstairs to the bathroom mirror to see what the words looked like. And I would have to run back downstairs because I didn't get them all. Well, I finally got them. And so I wanted to tell my friends, but I didn't want to stumble. So I practiced and practiced and practiced. And I was able to say very perfectly to my friends, well, my father is trying to determine the maximum permissible burden of radioactivity in the human body. Well, they just looked blank. So that's sort of the atmosphere in which I was the daughter of a leading radiological scientist. So in this photo, first, I want to say these photos were put together for me by Patrick Grage, our computer specialist for the Tuesday Club. And that's why they look so nice, because he really knew how to do it. Also, my wonderful daughter, Dr. Emily Godfrey, helped add some to that. And then, of course, I had the help of Secretary Judy Bond, and I really wanted to say thank you very much to everyone, including Ron Montagna for helping with the pictures you're going to see today. So the major work of these pictures was done by Patrick Grage, our computer specialist. Thank you. So, first, let me tell you what nuclear medicine is. As you probably already know, it's a specialty that uses radioactive tracers to assess bodily functions and to diagnose and treat disease. And just for your information, the tracing started in the early 40s when my father was tracing radioactive activity in the metabolisms of mice. So of course, you always start on something less than humans when you're trying to experiment. Next slide. Ron, may I have the next slide, please? Of course, they all were before you came. All right. So this is in 1946, the year after the atomic bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. My father was called to the atomic bomb test at the Bikini South Pacific Islands, which was conducted by the government the year after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because they wanted to look more carefully at what really happened. He was aboard the radiological ship Haven, monitoring the radiation that the bomb had released into the Pacific waters. My mother and I were sitting on the living room floor, listening to the live report on radio. Boom, came the bomb over the speaker. My mother jumped. Next slide. At the Memorial Cancer Center Hospital in New York City, my father developed cancer treatments. He was able to do this because in 1942, he had defined the method to measure radioactive doses internally in the body. He laid out the theory and formulae that nuclear medicine has used ever since. Also in 1942, next slide, please, the daughter of Madame Curie, Eve, was reporting for the New York Times in America, and she visited my father at Memorial Hospital. And of course, they took a picture in front of the beautiful painting of her mother, Madame Marie Curie, who discovered radium in 1897 and also had the vision to see that radium would someday be used in medicine. Next slide. In 1946, the use of radioactive iodine, which was confined just to the thyroid gland that had cancer, was extended by my father to other parts of the body where the thyroid cancer had metastasized, namely the bones, the lung, the liver, the brain. This was a major and significant start in nuclear medicine. Next slide. When my father gave the first radioactive dose, oral dose, to the patient with the metastasized thyroid cancer, he wanted the patient to feel comfortable. So he said, oh, this is just a radium cocktail. And that kind of took hold in the media. Next slide, please. In order to make the doses accurate, precise, and appropriate. My father had to constantly measure. And what you see here is a proportional counter in which he was able to discern the energies of the radioactive liquid inside. And that radioactive liquid, if you give me please the next slide. Whoops, sorry, go back. Was counted in the Marinelli beaker that you'll see in a little while, which he designed, which is still used today, not just for medicine, but also in industry and industrial. I think it was used to measure content of radium in the deep wells in the earth. So it's been quite useful in other aspects besides medicine. So slide 5 shows the Marinelli beaker. It doesn't. All right. What happened was the government got wind of Marinelli's expertise in radium in humans. And with all the testing of the new bombs in the Pacific Ocean and the uses of radium in the industries associated with the bomb production, like the fuel industries and the expansion of nuclear reactors, they really needed to know urgently what will be the future effects of radium in the human body. So Memorial Hospital, his laboratory at Memorial Hospital, being in New York City, where space is rather limited, was not really large enough. So the government offered him a brand new laboratory and all the staff and equipment he needed to go forward with determining future effects of radium in the human body, because the government urgently needed to know what was going to happen with all of the bombs they were producing and testing. So we moved from Yonkers, New York to Chicago. Next slide. And here is Argonne National Laboratory, which is quite extensive. It was a beautiful woods that was out in the middle of nowhere. Today it's located in Lamont, Illinois, which is like west of Hinsdale. But at the time, it was really unknown. And Fermi's reactor, which was the sustained nuclear reaction that made possible the making of the atomic bomb, they wanted to develop it into a reactor, but they wanted to do that in secret. So they moved it to the Argonne Woods, where there was nothing out there. It was just in the middle of nowhere. And then after they hid the Fermi reactor in the Argonne Woods, then they built Argonne National Laboratory. And that's when we moved to Chicago. So my father and biologist Austin M. Bruce and another physicist, Johnny Rose and Larry Powers, all established the divisions at Argonne that were necessary to be able to go forward with with this big project to determine future effects of radium in humans. Marinelli thought the best way to know what the future is to study the past. So he found people who had been contaminated with radium in the past to determine what their current effects were and the amounts of radium that they currently had. And then he retroactively calculated how much they had been exposed to in the past to understand what was happening, what would happen with radium in the future. So he found some patients at the Elgin, Illinois State Hospital, a mental hospital, who had been injected with radium medicine in the 1930s before the results or the effects of radium were really understood. So they were quite contaminated, but they were still living. And that's what he wanted to know, is the people who were living with radium, how much did they have? Then he also studied the radium watch dial painters, whom you've probably heard about, who in watch factories, not only in New Jersey, but also in New York, in Illinois, worked in factories painting radium ink on the dials of watches to make them luminous in the dark. And these patients, of course, unfortunately, had made points on their paintbrushes by putting them between their lips, dipping them in the radium ink, painting, putting them between their lips, dipping them in the radium ink. So most of these people died horrible deaths with cancer on their faces and upper bodies. But he found them and got permission from their families either to exhume them or to study people who were still living. And this gave him information about how much radium they had had in the first place. He also studied the Marshall Islanders, who had been exposed from the fallout from the bombs dropped in the Pacific Ocean. As he was studying these patients at Argonne, he invented in 1950 a whole body counter, which was very, very sensitive. And it was, you could say in a way, it was like the scanners you see at an airport, except there were no pictures. You had to imagine what it looked like. You had to use the numbers, the readouts of the numbers of the energies of the radiations that it detected. So his whole body counter that he invented in 1950 was low-level gamma ray spectrometry. And a person who had been radium exposed stood in front of it and was, the radium he contained was detected. May I have the next slide, please? May I have the next slide, please? So he put this whole body counter, which is very, very, very sensitive, inside a very, very heavy shield, a 6 by 6 foot room, so that he could keep out cosmic radiation of the smallest measurements, because he was measuring very small doses of radium or amounts of radium that were in a contaminated person. Well, he called the Navy and he asked for pre-World War II steel ripped from the hulls of the Navy ships that never had been exposed to atomic energy to construct this room. And he lined it with overlapping sheets of lead So this thing weighed 52 tons. And I remember saying to him one day when he was complaining about all the paperwork he had to do for the Atomic Energy Commission for this project, I remember saying to him, well, Dad, why don't you just go someplace else where you don't have to do all that work and do your research? And he just said, well, you know, I have some rather special equipment I've already put in my laboratory. Never said a word about 52 tons. So I was talking to Patrick Grage about it. And being a scientist, Patrick started immediately calculating 6 by 6 feet and the steel. And he ended up saying that, you know, this thing really had to be very strongly supported because you certainly couldn't put it on a floor in any building. I knew that my father had put it in the basement. He said, yeah, in the basement, but it had to have at least 3 feet of cement, of a cement base, not to go through the ground. So this lead line shield protected his very sensitive whole body counter from the invasion of any cosmic radioactivity because it was so well shielded. Well, I took a tour the other day, or about a month ago, 2 months ago, at Argonne, and they said they showed this big hump in the middle of the Argonne campus, and they said, well, that's where we keep an instrument that scientists use after they've done research to determine what was their exposure to radium, to radiations. So it turns out it was my father's original 1950 whole body counter and the 52-ton shield that they still had underground. They said they had raised, my father really put it way underground. They raised it a little bit, but to protect it with, you know, from the atmosphere, they also used the earth. So it was like a little hill covered. It was a grassy hill, and I just looked at it. It looked very innocuous, but it was the same one, and they're still using it today. Please show the next slide. So my father went to international conferences to share this important information that the whole world wanted to know, which was how much radium can the human body take before it's harmed? And that's what he was trying to find out. So one of the people he met with was in the forefront of this picture, Georges Hevesy, who's a Nobel Prize winner, who also did the investigation and tracing of radium in laboratory mice in order to see how it was used in living metabolism, animal metabolism. So there's Georges Hevesy, my father, and Titus Evans, the physicist from the University of Ohio. Next slide, please. Well, my father's studies on radium in the human body became very important worldwide, and many other laboratories and scientists contributed information needed to continue this question. So the American Radium Society awarded my father the Janeway Medal in 1958. And of course, you can see my mother just glowing with pride. One of the other things my father did that was information that was new to the radium research communities throughout the world was he emphasized the importance of environment on radium absorbed by the human body. They hadn't thought too much about environment. Well, of course, now there's a whole environmental agency that the government has on this matter. I should say that one of the basic contributions he made to nuclear medicine was the determination of the units of measurements that medicine used for 60 years, which were the rad and the rem. And the rad means Röntgen equivalent in man, and rem, no, that's rem. Rad means Röntgen absorbed dose. So what's the connection between the Röntgen and radium? Well, the Röntgen was the unit of measurement used to determine the intensity or strength of X-ray. And X-ray was already quite well known by doctors because it had been around for a while, and it was used in diagnosis and treatment. But radium wasn't so well known. So my father adapted the Röntgen unit so that it could also be used in its adapted form to measure radium, the dose of radium. And that's when he gave the words rad and rem, Röntgen absorbed dose, rad, rem, Röntgen equivalent in man. Why? Because they're two different things. The dose that you take in from the outside is one measurement, but the internal radium that your body absorbs is another measurement. So that's why there's the rad and the rem. So Marinelli went on to develop the dosimetry and spectrometry, not only to detect ionizing radiations, that is, radiations that are determined by their physical energy, but also to quantify naturally radioactive elements in the human body. And the one that we all have in us is potassium. So his development of the sensitivity of the low-level gamma ray spectrometry that he developed actually detected for the first time the natural potassium that we all have in our bodies. And this, of course, was the beginning of what you and I have when we go to the doctor's office and we get a test, a lab report of what's contained in our blood. Potassium was the first element that was able to be measured. Next slide, please. Well, this was one of the later developments of his spectrometry. It was called the time of flight camera. And I had a definition of that somewhere. It means the measurement of light that's reflected, which is a different type of measurement that's even more specific and more lower and lower and lower level than any other, done by reflected light. And this camera, which he developed in the late 50s or early 60s, opened the developments of scanning technologies that are so spectacular today. By 1970, other researchers had expanded his studies of radium in bone and gathered worldwide data so that it was pretty clear that what he perceived in 1950 was the truth, which was that radium-224, which was found in the Illinois State Hospital patients, remember those patients who had been injected with radium in 1930? And the radium dial painters, they also had radium-224 in their bodies. Well, then he found that the Danish thoratrast patients also had radium-224 in their bodies. Well, how did they get radium in their bodies? Well, the Danish hospitals used thoratrast as a diagnostic medium, and it decayed or had daughters that were called, that it gave rise to radium, to radioactive energy. And these three groups, the 1930s Elgin State Hospital patients injected with radium, the radium dial painters who ingested it on their paintbrushes, and now the new Danish thoratrast patients, these were the three sources of indisputable evidence that radium-224 was the culprit that induced cancer in humans. So the argument and the denials that went on for decades ended. And the conference in Utah, which gathered scientists from around the world who brought their own research to add to his, delivered this proof that radium-224 is the source of radium-induced cancer. So let me give you a little background on my father. Next slide. Well, there's the radium-224 I just talked about. Next slide. My father was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, 1906. It was a beautiful city, built up with beautiful architectural buildings of European and French and Italian designers. It instilled in him a great sense of beauty. In fact, the time in which he was born was the Belle Epoque in Buenos Aires, which was very much like the Belle Epoque in Paris. So early in childhood, he absorbed this great sense of beauty. His Catholic family inculcated values, basic humanistic values, and respect for others, which my father incorporated in all his science. So that when there was the ambition to experiment on humans, my father put in a rule at Argonne that human experimentation was prohibited. Would you believe that in 1950 there were actually places around America where humans were being used as to experiment on radium? Well, this was prohibited at Argonne. And subsequently, my father, these values he engendered in childhood gave him the courage to remain faithful to the truth of science, regardless of outside pressures and political pressures. So let me give the background in the next slide, please. Oh, there he is. There's his family. He's on the far left. It was a very loving family, and they lived very well in Buenos Aires. His father was a banker, along with his uncles. Well, in 1918, his father died of a heart attack. And the other brothers had died earlier. They all seemed to die of heart attacks rather early in life. So the mother found herself a widow with 6 children. So she took everyone back to their hometown in Agnone, Italy. I don't know if we have a picture of that. Next slide, let's see. Do we have it? No, okay, go back, please. So she took the family back to Agnone, Italy, which was the seat of the family since the year 1100, when my father's family founded a bell foundry that made these huge church bells for the many, many Catholic churches around the world, and they are still in business today. But this did not benefit the widow, my father's widowed mother. So the next slide, please. In 1926, my father immigrated to New York City, and he carried this gold medal that he was awarded on his graduation the year before from the Alessandro Volta Technical School, where he studied electrical science. He attended the Cooper Union College of Electrical Engineering, which was a scholarship-only school because he had to be on scholarship. And his friends called him Leo. 3 years after arriving in America, he was hired to the biophysical laboratory at the Memorial Cancer Hospital by Dr. Failla. Next film, please. And there's Dr. Failla. Dr. Failla had been a student of Madame Curie, and he carried back to Memorial Hospital her teachings and himself made huge strides in understanding the qualities and quantities of radium, leading to the uses of radium in medicine. Hardly a year after working for Dr. Failla, my father made possible comparison of radium and X-rays for the first time by adapting the well-known X-ray unit, the Röntgen, to the quantification of radium gamma ray energy. And this is what led to the cancer treatments he developed at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Institute. Well, Dr. Failla was so pleased with that comparison that he announced it at the Third International Congress of Radiology in Paris in 1930, and he credited his young assistant. Next slide, please. At Memorial Hospital, that's where Marinelli developed the Röntgen, RAD, and REM. And on the left is the old Memorial Hospital, and on the right, the new. The old Memorial Hospital was based on the medical knowledge at the time, which was that cancer was a death sentence. There was just no recovery. So the Memorial Hospital was built sort of like a beautiful castle. So people who went there to die would feel some comfort in its beautiful surroundings. But then with the advance and the development of radium cancer treatments, the new Memorial Sloan Kettering Center is where research and clinical practice is done now. Next slide, please. Well, this is my father at home. Concerned, but finally, I'll tell you what, somewhere in the middle 1980s, his friend, who was also a family friend of our family, who was dean of the University of Chicago Medical School, gave a retirement, was honored at a retirement at Mandel Hall. And his booklet had all the things my father had done credited under his supervision to the university.
Okay.
Well, I called him up. And first, of course, I said, Dr. Jacobson, I want to congratulate you on your 80th anniversary and da, da, da. I said, but I really would like to know, how is it possible you mentioned everything my father did and you never once mentioned his name? Well, he said, it was really just sort of an on-campus thing. I said, wait a minute. My father was professor of radiology under your medical school on the campus. And then he changed the subject completely. And he said, well, you know, it was the idea of, let me think what the name of the head of Oregon was at the time. At the moment, it skips me. But he said it was the idea of the head of Oregon at the time to bring the nuclear hospital to the University of Chicago rather than to Oregon. Well, the nuclear hospital was part of my father's design of this huge project to determine the future effects of radium in the human body. And my father went to Washington to get the funds. And I know that because I was the guest of the father of my friend who used to invite me for dinner. And I was 10 years old, and I was so impressed that he would include my name in the grace he prayed before dinner. And I just felt I was just, the daughter of this famous, wonderful man. Well, it turned out that, I lost my train of thought.
Let me ask you a follow-up, though. Maybe we'll go there. You've told us so much about what he's accomplished for us, and you tried to make it understandable to an audience that is not that technical minded on the medical side. But what about the man? What about the father? What about the grandfather? What about the things he might have been to you and to the family? Did he cook? Did he fish? Did he golf? Did he do other things, or was he just totally wed to the academics?
He was a very loving father. I used to climb on him, between his shoulder and the newspaper when he came home from Memorial Hospital, to hug him. He was a very loving father. And of course, he used to dance with me on the living room floor because he used to buy all these Spanish and Argentinian songs and play them on the record player. So
maybe tangos.
Yes, it was. And of course, he used to take me on Saturdays for walks outside to get me away from my mother, and he would buy me ice cream. He was just a very loving father. And in high school, he actually entertained, I don't remember what, but I used to have these long, debates with him. And he might say such things, but do you realize the national budget for cosmetics is higher than the national budget for medicine? And he would give out the numbers. So it was just always very exciting to talk to him. So as far as
maybe I could ask your granddaughter's viewpoint. Why don't you share for us? What's your name again, please?
Yes. So, so I'm Emily Godfrey. I'm Judith's daughter, and I'm a physician at the University of Washington in Seattle, Washington. But I have, sorry, I guess Ron's telling me to come up here. So my husband and I did buy a home, a little condo in Evanston, so it would be close to my mother a couple months a year. And Ron asked me to speak from the point of view of a granddaughter of my grandfather, who we called Granddaddy. And he passed away when I was 6, so I was pretty young. And I think what I really gained from him was what my mother reported as just that Italian warmth and lovingness, so that to me was what was so present about him, of how accepting he was of just all his grandchildren. So he had 9 grandchildren, and just how incredibly warm and loving and just so happy to see us. And it really wasn't until my mother started researching him. I mean, so I'm one of kind of really the only physician in the family. So although my mother really was a musician and I have a lot of artists in the family, I decided okay, I see. So I have to stand in the center. I decided to do the science partly because, even though I didn't know necessarily what my grandfather did at the age of 6, I understood that he was a scientist, and I understood the integrity behind that and the humanness behind that. And so I think that is really what I got from my grandfather. But because my mother researched him and was able to articulate his work and his contribution to the world, it really inspired me to pursue that. So I'm a primary care physician. And as you know, primary care is not appreciated perhaps the way specialists are. But what I'm able to do as a primary care physician is to really bring that human element to medicine, and to really partner with my patients and bring some sort of understanding so that when they go for their nuclear medicine tests and their radiology tests, I can bring some interpretation, some understanding to those reports that often patients now are able to see, but not thoroughly understand. So that's really how my grandfather influenced me. I'll hand it back to Ron.
I think she deserves a hand for that. And I think Mom does too, doesn't she?
Okay. Okay.
We received really a wonderful picture of a great man, and I just knew there had to be an Italian connection. I think we'll turn it over to Judy. We're saying thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Judith. It's been wonderful getting to know you. And I will go home and tell my grandson about the painters. He asked me that question, was he involved with the Elgin painters? So I can tell him that now.
Yes, yes.
So
I want to thank you for your support, because of course I could not have done this alone. And the Tuesday Club members have been really very helpful, and I'm very grateful, especially to Patrick and Jill and.
We have a question before we let you go.
Yes.
Yeah, that was a great talk.
Thank you.
I noticed your dad died at age 67 and a half.
Yes.
Did he die of cancer exposure to radium?
Absolutely not. And because he did so many studies, he also incorporated himself in his studies. So you can read his low or zero levels of radium in his body. No, he died of a heart attack following surgery for the carotid artery because he had high blood pressure, and his surgeon thought it was due to a clogged artery. Well, the artery was clogged, but not with cholesterol. It was clogged from the wear and tear on the inside of his vessels from the extreme stress he suffered as he led this crusade worldwide. So, we kept the house very calm. We knew he had a lot of stress, but it really took its toll. Of course, he never complained, but my mother, often would mention he, needed to rest. He didn't rest much. He sat in the chair and did a lot of reading every night and writing of papers every night. But the stress took its toll on his blood pressure.
And once again, please give Judith a big round of applause. And thanks for coming. See you next week.